When you think of Thanksgiving, what's the first image that pops into your head? Probably a scene straight out of a storybook, right? Stern-faced pilgrims in black hats, sharing a bountiful harvest with friendly Native Americans. We see it every November. Turkeys, pumpkin pie, and the story of that famous 1621 feast in Plymouth, Massachusetts. It's a powerful image, one that's been passed down for generations. It represents peace, gratitude, and the coming together of different cultures. But what if I told you that cozy, iconic image isn't the whole story? What if the first Thanksgiving wasn't in chilly New England at all? What if it happened somewhere warmer? And much, much earlier? Today, we're going on a journey back in time, peeling back the layers of history to uncover the hidden stories of Thanksgiving. We all travel far from Plymouth Rock to discover other feasts of thanks that have been largely forgotten. It's a story filled with surprising twists, incredible journeys, and a more complex, more fascinating picture of America's origins than the one we learned in school. So get comfortable, because we're about to challenge everything you thought you knew about the first Thanksgiving. Let's set the scene, not in Massachusetts, but much further south in the sun-drenched landscape of what is now Florida. The year is 1565. That's more than 50 years before the Mayflower even set sail. A Spanish admiral named Pedro Menéndez de Avilés lands on the coast with over 800 colonists. They've just survived a perilous, storm-tossed voyage across the Atlantic. They're exhausted, but they're alive. Their first act upon landing? It wasn't to build a fort or claim the land. It was to hold a mass of thanksgiving. After the religious service, Menendez invited the local Seloy tribe, the indigenous people of the area, to join them for a meal. Now, this wasn't a feast of turkey and cranberry sauce. The Spaniards had limited provisions left from their journey hardtack biscuits. Cocido, a rustic stew made from pork, chickpeas, and garlic, and red wine. The Seloy people likely brought their own food to share: fish, venison, beans, and squash. Can you picture it? A different group of Europeans, a different Native American tribe, a different menu, all coming together in a moment of shared relief and gratitude, decades before the Pilgrims. This event in St. Augustine, Florida, is what many historians now consider the first documented Thanksgiving feast between Europeans and Native Americans in the future United States. Now let's journey west, to Texas. The year is 1598, more than 2 decades before the Plymouth Feast. A Spanish expedition led by Juan de Ocade has just completed a brutal 50-day trek across the unforgiving Chihuahuan Desert. They were desperate, running low on water and food, with many on the brink of collapse. Finally, they reached the banks of the Rio Grande. To them, it was a miracle. They had survived. To celebrate their salvation, Ocade ordered a great feast of Thanksgiving. The expedition's chroniclers wrote about it in detail. They hunted for fish from the river and game from the surrounding land. They rested, recuperated, and gave thanks to God for their deliverance. They also invited the local Manso people to join their celebration. So here we have another powerful scene. Spanish explorers and Native Americans sharing a meal of gratitude on the banks of a river in Texas, years before the Pilgrims' famous dinner. It's a testament to the universal human impulse to give thanks after surviving hardship, a theme we see again and again in these early stories. So if these earlier Thanksgivings happened in Florida and Texas, why does the Plymouth story get all the attention? Why is that the one we celebrate every year? Well, the answer has more to do with storytelling and national identity than with historical accuracy. The story of the Plymouth Feast wasn't widely known until the 19th century. In the 1840s, a long-lost manuscript written by Pilgrim leader William Bradford was rediscovered. It contained a brief, 1-paragraph description of the 1621 harvest celebration with the Wampanoag people. This story resonated deeply with Americans at the time, especially in New England. They were looking for a national origin story, something that felt uniquely American. The tale of the devout, hard-working Pilgrims overcoming adversity and living in harmony with their neighbors was the perfect fit. A powerful magazine editor named Sarah Josepha Halley, who you might know as the author of Mary Had a Little Lamb, championed the cause. For decades, she campaigned tirelessly to make Thanksgiving a national holiday. She wrote letters to presidents and editorials to the public, promoting the Pilgrim story as the quintessential American experience. Her efforts finally paid off in 1863. In the midst of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln was looking for a way to unite a fractured nation. He saw the power in Hale's vision. He officially declared the last Thursday in November as a national day of thanksgiving and praise. Lincoln's proclamation intentionally focused on the New England narrative, the story of the Pilgrims. It was a story of unity and perseverance that he hoped would inspire a war-torn country. The Spanish Catholic celebrations in Florida and Texas just didn't fit the Protestant, English-centric narrative that 19th-century America wanted to tell about itself. And so the Plymouth story became the asterisk Thanksgiving story, but as we've seen, the history is so much richer. Recognizing these other Thanksgivings isn't about replacing the Plymouth story. It's about adding to it. It shows us that the act of giving thanks is a thread that runs through many different chapters of the American story, involving different people, in different places for different reasons. It's a Spanish tradition in Florida, a Texan story of survival, and yes, a New England harvest festival. Each one adds a new color to the beautiful, complex mosaic of our shared history. Understanding this helps us see that Thanksgiving is more than just one event. It's a universal human tradition. This richer history also invites us to look at the traditional story with more nuance. The relationship between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag wasn't a simple, happy storybook tale. The 1621 feast was a moment of diplomacy and temporary peace in a relationship that was incredibly complex and ultimately tragic. For the Wampanoag and other native peoples, the arrival of Europeans marked the beginning of immense loss of land, of life, and of culture. For many Native Americans today, Thanksgiving is not a day of celebration, but a day of mourning, a solemn reminder of the devastating consequences of colonization. Acknowledging this painful reality is not about feeling guilty or ruining the holiday. It's about being honest. It's about understanding the full weight of history, both the moments of cooperation and the long, painful history of conflict. It allows us to have a more mature and meaningful conversation about who we are as a nation. We can hold both truths at once. We can be grateful for our blessings and for the togetherness the holiday brings, while also acknowledging the suffering that is part of its legacy. True gratitude requires honesty. So, as you gather with your loved ones this year, maybe you can share a bit of this bigger story. The story of the Spanish in Florida, the explorers in Texas, and the complex truth of the Plymouth Feast. Knowing this history doesn't diminish the holiday. It enriches it. It transforms Thanksgiving from a simple fairy tale into a powerful opportunity to reflect on our diverse origins, the complexities of our past, and the importance of gratitude, empathy, and understanding in our present. The story of Thanksgiving is bigger, messier, and far more interesting than we ever thought. Thank you so much for joining me on this historical journey today. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the stories that shape our world. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What does Thanksgiving mean to you? Until next time, stay curious. Imagine stepping out of a time machine, not into a bustling city, but onto a shore shrouded in mist. The air that greets you is thick, humid, almost alive. You can taste the salt carried on a relentless sea breeze, a whisper from a vast, mysterious ocean. This is the coast of Florida, a place we now know for its sunshine and sandy beaches, but which was once the very edge of the known world. Welcome to Chapter 2, The Forgotten Coast of Beginnings. For the first European explorers who arrived here, this wasn't a vacation destination. It was the frontier of reality itself. Everything they knew, their entire world, was behind them, across an unforgiving expanse of water. Ahead lay a land that was both terrifying and tantalizing. A land that hadn't yet been mapped, named, or understood by their civilization. This coastline was a crucible, a place where dreams of gold and glory collided with the harsh realities of a wild, untamed continent. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture the scene. Towering, unfamiliar trees dripping with moisture, the symphony of insects, and unseen creatures buzzing from the dense foliage, the humid air clinging to your skin like a second layer. For those early sailors weary from months at sea, this wasn't just land. It was a promise. A promise of fresh water, of solid ground beneath their feet, of a new beginning. But it was also a place of immense danger. Every shadow could hide a threat, every rustle in the undergrowth could signal an encounter with the unknown. This land demanded more than just courage, it demanded faith. Faith in their mission, faith in their God, and faith in themselves. It was a place where survival was the daily currency. Every sunrise was a victory, every meal a testament to their resilience. The stories of these first encounters are not just tales of conquest. They are profound human stories of hope. Hope for a better life, hope for discovery, and the simple, desperate hope to see another day. Think about the sheer audacity of it. To leave everything behind and sail towards the horizon, driven by a mixture of ambition, curiosity, and belief. This coastline was their first test. Before they could push into the vast interior of the continent, they had to survive here, on this forgotten coast. They had to learn the rhythms of the tides, the secrets of the swamps, and the ways of the people who had called this place home for centuries. The natives, of course, had long understood this land. For them, it wasn't the edge of the world, but the center of it. Their lives were interwoven with the ebb and flow of the sea and the bounty of the forest. The arrival of these strange ships with their pale-skinned passengers marked the beginning of a profound and often tragic transformation. Two worlds, two sets of beliefs, two completely different ways of life, meeting for the first time on this humid, sun-drenched shore. The air here still feels ancient, as if it holds the echoes of those first meetings, the prayers of those hopeful explorers, and the silent wisdom of the original inhabitants. It's a place where you can almost feel the weight of history in the warm breeze. This wasn't just a geographical boundary, it was a psychological one. To cross it meant leaving the old world and its certainties behind forever. It was the birth of a new identity, forged in the crucible of survival. This coast was the stage for incredible dramas of human endurance. Men battled starvation, disease, and the constant fear of the unknown. They clung to their faith like a life raft in a stormy sea, scribbling in their journals by candlelight, documenting strange plants and animals, and dreaming of the riches they believed lay just beyond the next river bend. Their hope was a stubborn, defiant flame against the immense darkness of the wilderness. They saw signs of divine providence in a sudden rainstorm that filled their water casks, or a chance encounter with a friendly tribe that offered them food. And they saw the devil's work in the fevers that swept through their camps and the hostile encounters that cost them their comrades. This land was a spiritual battleground as much as a physical one. Every day was a test of faith, a reaffirmation of their purpose for being there. We often think of history in terms of grand battles and famous names, but so much of it is written in these quiet, desperate moments of survival. The simple act of finding a clean spring, of catching a fish, of building a shelter that could withstand a tropical storm, these were the victories that mattered most on the forgotten coast. These were the moments that allowed history to move forward. This place, this humid strip of land between the forest and the sea, represents the very beginning of the American story as we often tell it. It's a story born of a clash of cultures, a story of incredible hardship, and a story fueled by an unshakable belief in the promise of a new world. The hope that drove those first explorers across the ocean didn't die on this coast. It was tempered, tested, and transformed into something stronger, something more resilient. So as we continue our journey, remember this place. Remember the feel of the salt spray, the oppressive humidity, the chorus of the unseen wild. This is where the dream of a new world first touched the shore. It's a place of hope, of faith, and above all, of survival. A coast that was once forgotten, but whose echoes still shape the world we live in today. Thank you so much for joining me on this chapter of our journey. If you found this story compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the past. Your support means the world and allows us to keep telling these important stories. We'll see you in the next chapter. When most of us think about the first Thanksgiving, our minds jump straight to 1621. We picture Pilgrims and Native Americans sharing a harvest feast at Plymouth Rock. It's a powerful image, one that's been taught in schools for generations. But what if I told you that this story of America and of Thanksgiving starts much, much earlier? To find the real beginning, we have to rewind the clock, go back more than half a century before the Mayflower even set sail. Forget Plymouth Rock for a moment, and journey with me back to the year 1565. Imagine a world where England was still a secondary power and Spain ruled the waves. The Spanish Empire, with its mighty galleons laden with gold and silver from the New World, was the undisputed superpower. Its explorers, the conquistadors, were charting vast, unknown territories. They weren't just searching for gold. They were claiming land, establishing colonies, and spreading their faith across a continent they called La Florida. This wasn't just the state we know today. La Florida was a massive, mysterious expanse of land stretching from modern-day Florida all the way up the Atlantic coast. A place of dense forests, strange animals, and powerful native civilizations that had existed for thousands of years. In 1565, while Shakespeare was just a baby and Queen Elizabeth I was still cementing her rule in England, a Spanish admiral named Pedro Menéndez de Avilés was given a critical mission by King Philip II of Spain. His orders were clear: sail to La Florida, drive out any rival European powers, and establish a permanent Spanish settlement. This wasn't just about exploration anymore. It was about control. The French had recently established a small Fort Caroline near present-day Jacksonville, and the Spanish king saw this as a direct threat to his claims and, more importantly, to the vital shipping lanes his treasure fleets used to sail back to Spain. Menendez assembled a powerful fleet. This was no small-scale venture. He gathered over 1,000 soldiers, sailors and settlers, women, and children, along with livestock, supplies, and tools. They were coming not just to conquer, but to build a new life, to create a Spanish foothold in North America that would last for centuries. On August 28, 1565, the feast day of St. Augustine, Menendez's ships spotted the coastline of Florida. He sailed into a natural harbor and named the site San Augustine in honor of the day. This was it. This was the spot where he would build his colony. On September 8, 1565, Pedro Menéndez de Avilés waded ashore. He was met not by hostility but by the local Timucua tribe, who watched with curiosity as the Spanish unfurled their royal banners and knelt to kiss the ground. A Catholic priest, Father Francisco Lopez, conducted a mass of thanksgiving, a mass to thank God for their safe arrival and for the founding of this new settlement. After the religious ceremony, Menendez ordered that a meal be prepared. He then invited his Timucua hosts to join him and his men. And they did. The Spanish shared the food they had brought with them, a simple stew made from salted pork, chickpeas, and hard biscuits, likely accompanied by red wine. The Timucua, in turn, probably shared what they had from the local land: fish, beans, corn, and squash. Think about that for a moment. Right there, on the sandy shores of Florida in 1565, Spanish settlers and Native Americans sat down together for a communal meal of Thanksgiving. This event happened 56 years before the Pilgrims' feast at Plymouth. It was the first documented instance of Europeans and Native Americans sharing a meal of thanks in what would become the United States. This was the first Thanksgiving. The settlement they founded that day, St. Augustine, would go on to become the oldest continuously inhabited European established city in the entire country. It's a city that still stands today, a testament to this forgotten chapter of American history. So why isn't this story more widely known? Why does the Plymouth Rock narrative dominate our national consciousness? Part of the reason is simple. History is often written by the victors. As the British colonies grew in power and influence, their stories, their culture, and their language became the dominant narrative of America's founding. The story of the English-speaking Pilgrims, seeking religious freedom and establishing a new society, fit perfectly into the mythology of the nation that would eventually emerge. The Spanish, who were often cast as the villains in the English version of history, and their Catholic traditions were pushed to the sidelines. Their contributions to the continent's history were downplayed, if not erased entirely. But the evidence is undeniable. Long before the Pilgrims endured their first harsh New England winter, the Spanish were building cities, creating families, and navigating complex relationships with the native populations of the Southeast. The story of St. Augustine is not just a piece of local Florida history. It's a crucial piece of American history. It challenges our traditional understanding of who we are and where we come from. It reminds us that the American story is not a single straight line, but a rich, complex tapestry woven from many different threads: Spanish, French, English, and most importantly, the countless Native American nations who were here long before any European ship appeared on the horizon. Understanding this earlier Thanksgiving doesn't diminish the story of the Pilgrims. Their perseverance and their own interactions with the Wampanoag people are an important part of the American experience. But expanding our view to include the events of 1565 gives us a fuller, more accurate picture. It shows us that the impulse for giving thanks, for marking a new beginning with a shared meal, is a universal human experience that played out in different ways, in different places across this vast continent. The story of America's first Thanksgiving didn't start in the cold north of Plymouth Rock. It began under the warm sun of La Florida, in a moment of shared humanity between Spanish explorers and the Timucua people. And that's a story worth remembering. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this chapter of hidden history as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories that challenge what you thought you knew. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next episode. See you next time. Welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we turn the page to Chapter 4, and we meet a figure who would forever change the map of the New World, Pedro Menéndez de Avilés. This isn't just a story of a sailor. It's the story of a man driven by ambition, faith, and an unwavering loyalty to his king. A commander, a navigator, a devout Christian, and an architect of empire. His name is etched into the very foundations of the oldest city in the United States, and his actions would set the stage for centuries of conflict and cultural exchange. So, who was this man, Pedro Menéndez? Born in 1519 in the rugged coastal region of Asturias, Spain, the sea wasn't just his backyard, it was his destiny. He came from a noble but not exceedingly wealthy family, which meant he had to forge his own path to greatness, and forge it he did. By his teenage years, he was already at sea, not on a leisurely cruise, but as a corsair, a privateer, fighting off French pirates who plagued Spanish shipping lanes. He was a natural leader, sharp, decisive, and utterly fearless. His early exploits earned him a reputation as one of Spain's most brilliant and reliable naval commanders. He knew the tides, the winds, and the hearts of sailors like the back of his hand. His skill did not go unnoticed. He quickly rose through the ranks, catching the eye of none other than King Philip II of Spain. The king saw in Menendez more than just a talented sea captain. He saw a man of immense loyalty and unwavering conviction. At this time, Spain was at the zenith of its power, a global empire upon which the sun never set. But this empire was constantly under threat. Rival European powers, particularly France, were beginning to challenge Spain's dominance in the Americas, establishing their own outposts and colonies. The particular thorn in King Philip's side was a French settlement in a land the Spanish called *La Florida*. This vast, largely unexplored territory was strategically vital. Spanish treasure fleets, laden with gold and silver from the mines of Mexico and Peru, sailed along the Florida coast on their way back to Spain. A French presence there was like a pirate's den, right on the highway of Spain's wealth. Even more insulting to the deeply Catholic Philip II was the fact that these French colonists were Huguenots Protestants. In his eyes, their presence was not just a geopolitical threat, but a heretical stain on a land he claimed for Catholic Spain. So the king turned to his most trusted commander. In 1565, Philip II gave Pedro Menéndez de Avilés a monumental task, a royal commission known as an acinto. He was to sail to Florida, expel the French, secure the territory for Spain, and crucially, establish permanent settlements to prevent any future incursions. But this mission was about more than just conquest and defense. It was also a spiritual crusade. Menendez was charged with bringing the Catholic faith to the indigenous peoples of Florida, to convert them and bring them into the fold of the Spanish crown. For a man as deeply religious as Menendez, this was not just a royal order. It was a divine calling. Menendez poured his own personal fortune into the expedition. This wasn't just a job for him, it was his life's work. He assembled a massive fleet, a formidable armada of ships packed with over 1,000 people's soldiers, sailors, artisans, farmers, and their families. This was not a simple military raid. It was a mission of colonization. They brought tools, seeds, livestock, and everything needed to build a new life on a distant shore. Priests also joined the voyage, their purpose to establish missions and begin the work of conversion. The journey across the Atlantic was, as always, perilous. Storms battered the fleet, scattering ships and testing the resolve of everyone on board. But Menendez, the seasoned navigator, pushed forward relentlessly. He was racing against time. He knew a French fleet under the command of Jean Ribaut was also on its way to reinforce the French settlement at Fort Caroline. The fate of Florida would be decided by who got there first and who could seize the advantage. On August 28, 1565, the feast day of St. Augustine of Hippo, Menendez's fleet finally sighted the coast of Florida. It was a moment of profound significance for the deeply pious commander. In honor of the saint, he named the spot where he intended to land St. Augustine. He sailed up the coast, locating the French at Fort Caroline on the St. Johns River. A tense naval confrontation ensued, but the initial skirmish was indecisive. The French ships cut their cables and fled to sea, while Menendez, recognizing the need for a secure base of operations, sailed back south to the harbor he had named. There, on September 8, 1565, Pedro Menéndez de Avilés came ashore with banners flying and trumpets sounding. With great ceremony, he claimed all of La Florida for God and for King Philip II of Spain. He and his colonists began the hard work of fortifying a small indigenous village, laying the foundations for what would become the city of St. Augustine. This was not a temporary fort. This was the beginning of a permanent European settlement, the very first in what would become the United States. But the French threat remained. Jean Ribaut, the French commander, decided to take a huge gamble. He took most of his soldiers, boarded his ships, and sailed south to attack the Spanish at St. Augustine, hoping to wipe them out before they could fully establish themselves. Menendez watched them sail away and saw his opportunity, but then fate intervened in a dramatic way. A violent hurricane, what the Spanish called tormenta swept up the coast. The storm that Menendez had likely been tracking with his expert mariner, S.I. completely wrecked the French fleet, scattering Ribaut's ships and soldiers along the Florida beaches, miles to the south. Menendez, a brilliant and ruthless strategist, knew this was his moment. While the hurricane raged, he made a daring decision. Leaving a small garrison to defend St. Augustine, he gathered the majority of his soldiers and decided to march overland, through the flooded swamps and dense forests, to attack the now defenseless Fort Caroline. It was a brutal, audacious march, a testament to his leadership and the discipline of his men. They arrived, exhausted but determined, and took the French garrison completely by surprise. The fort fell quickly. Menendez then learned from local natives that groups of shipwrecked French soldiers were stranded on the beaches to the south. He marched his men down to an inlet, which would later be named Matanzas, the Spanish word for slaughters. There, he confronted the first group of survivors from Ribaut's fleet, including Jean Ribaut himself. The French were exhausted, unarmed, and at his mercy. Menendez, seeing them not only as military rivals but as heretics, offered them no quarter. The vast majority of the Frenchmen were executed. This brutal act secured Spanish dominance in Florida, but it also cemented Menendez's controversial legacy as both a heroic founder and a merciless conqueror. With the French threat eliminated, Menendez could focus on his primary mission, building a lasting Spanish colony. He governed Florida for nearly a decade, overseeing the growth of St. Augustine and establishing a chain of missions and forts up and down the coast. He explored the interior, forged alliances with some native tribes, and fought wars with others. He was a tireless administrator, constantly petitioning the king for more resources, more settlers, more support for his fledgling colony. His vision was for a vast, thriving Spanish Florida that would stretch far beyond the small settlement of St. Augustine. Pedro Menéndez de Avilés was a man of his time, a complex blend of piety and ruthlessness, vision and violence. He was a master mariner who saw the world as a chessboard for his king and a devout believer who saw his mission as a holy crusade. His actions in 1565 not only founded the oldest continuously inhabited European established city in the United States but also decisively shifted the balance of power in the New World, ensuring that Florida would be Spanish for the next 200 years. His story is a crucial, if often overlooked, chapter in the epic tale of America's origins. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the life of Pedro Menéndez. His story is a powerful reminder of the complex forces that shaped our world. If you found this chapter of history fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this one. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next episode. We love hearing from you, so please leave your thoughts and questions in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. The year is 1565, Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, a man forged in the crucible of naval warfare and unwavering in his devotion to the Spanish crown, stands on the precipice of his most audacious endeavor yet. His mission, handed down from King Philip II himself, is clear: sail to Florida, expel the French Huguenot intruders, and establish a permanent Spanish stronghold. But between Menendez and his destiny lies a formidable adversary, one that no cannon can subdue and no sword can parry, the vast, unforgiving Atlantic Ocean. As his fleet, a grand armada of over 19 ships carrying more than 1,500 souls, departs from the bustling port of Cadiz, a sense of nervous excitement fills the air. Soldiers, artisans, farmers, and their families all have staked their futures on this voyage. They are pioneers, driven by a cocktail of faith, ambition, and the promise of a new life in a land few Europeans have ever seen. Menendez himself is the embodiment of this drive. He is not merely an admiral. He is a crusader, a colonizer, a man with a holy mandate. The initial days at sea are a deceptive calm. The sun paints the sky in hues of gold and rose, and a gentle breeze pushes the galleons westward. The rhythmic creak of timbers, the snap of sails in the wind, and the call of sailors become the soundtrack of their new reality. Menendez uses this time to instill discipline, drilling his soldiers on deck and overseeing the distribution of rations. Priests lead daily prayers, their voices a steady drone against the whisper of the waves, reminding everyone that their journey is not just a military campaign, but a sacred pilgrimage. But the Atlantic is a fickle master. As they venture further from the familiar shores of Europe, the ocean's mood darkens. The sky, once a brilliant blue, turns to a bruised, menacing gray. The gentle swells that rocked them to sleep now grow into monstrous, heaving mountains of water. The first storm strikes with the fury of a vengeful god. Imagine being on one of those ships. You are packed into a cramped, damp space below deck. The world outside is a symphony of chaos. The wind howls like a banshee, tearing at the rigging with invisible claws. Rain, cold and relentless, lashes down, turning the decks into treacherous, slick surfaces. And then there are the waves, colossal walls of dark water that rise up, hang suspended for a terrifying moment, and then crash down upon the ship with the force of 1,000 battering rams. The galleon, a marvel of 16th century engineering, suddenly feels as fragile as a child's toy. Timbers groan and strain under the immense pressure, threatening to splinter at any moment. Below deck, water seeps through every crack, pooling on the floor, soaking everything, bedding, supplies, and spirits. The constant, violent pitching and rolling of the ship becomes a form of torture. Seasickness is rampant. The stench of vomit, bilge water, and unwashed bodies is overwhelming. Fear, cold, and misery become your constant companions. Up on deck, the scene is one of organized desperation. Sailors, clinging to ropes for their very lives, scramble across the swaying masts to reef the sails. Waves wash over the deck, threatening to sweep men into the churning abyss. The ship's master shouts orders, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. Every crack of a mast, every snap of a rope sends a fresh wave of terror through the crew. In this maelstrom, one wrong move, one moment of hesitation means death. Through it all, Menendez is a pillar of strength. He seems to be everywhere at once, his resolve as unyielding as the storm itself. He stands on the poop deck, drenched to the bone, his eyes fixed on the horizon, shouting encouragement to his men. His faith is his armor. He sees this tempest not as a random act of nature, but as a test from God. He gathers his officers and the priests, and together they kneel on the slick, heaving deck, their prayers a defiant cry against the gale. They pray for deliverance, for strength, for the success of their holy mission. This display of piety in the face of mortal danger is a powerful message to everyone aboard. Our commander's faith is unshakable, and therefore, so must be ours. Days blur into a nightmarish cycle of storm and respite. The fleet, once a proud, organized procession, is scattered across the vast ocean. Each captain is left to his own skill and luck to survive. One of Menendez's primary ships, the San Peleo, his flagship and the largest of the fleet, becomes separated. The journey is now not just a battle against the elements, but a desperate search for one another. Long, anxious days are spent scanning the horizon, hoping for the sight of a familiar sail. The uncertainty gnaws at everyone. Are they alone? Have the other ships sunk? Has the entire expedition failed before it even reached its destination? Rations, once carefully managed, begin to run low. The fresh water in the casks becomes stagnant and foul. Scurvy, the dreaded disease of long sea voyages, begins to whisper among the crew, its symptoms a grim reminder of their vulnerability. Yet they press on. What choice do they have? To turn back would be to admit defeat, not just to the storm but to God and their king. Menendez's determination is infectious. He reminds his men of the stakes, the glory of Spain, the salvation of souls, and the expulsion of their French rivals. He speaks of Florida not as a hostile wilderness, but as La Florida, the land of flowers, a new Eden promised to them by God. His words, delivered with conviction, are a balm to their frayed nerves. After weeks that feel like a lifetime, the fury of the storms begins to subside. The sky lightens, the seas calm, and one by one, ships begin to find each other, like lost siblings reuniting after a tragedy. Cheers erupt as masts are spotted on the horizon. The fleet, though battered and reduced in number, is not broken. Several ships were forced back to Spain or lost, but the core of the expedition, with Menendez at its head, has endured. The crossing has taken its toll. The ships are damaged, their hulls weakened, their sails in tatters. The people are exhausted, gaunt, and weary, but they are also transformed. They are no longer just soldiers and settlers. They are survivors. They have faced the absolute worst the Atlantic could throw at them, and have emerged on the other side. They have been tested by the sea and found worthy. Their shared ordeal has forged a powerful bond, a sense of shared purpose hardened by adversity. As they finally catch the trade winds that will carry them towards the Caribbean and then north to Florida, a new sense of hope takes root. They have faced the dragon and survived. The journey, a long and uncertain path filled with prayer and peril, is nearing its end. Menendez looks west, his gaze intense. His ships may be battered, but his spirit, and the spirit of his people, is more determined than ever. They were driven by faith and royal orders across a treacherous ocean, and now their destination is finally within reach. The struggle for Florida is about to begin. Thank you for joining us on this chapter of our journey. If you found this story compelling, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss what happens next when Menendez finally makes landfall. We'll see you in the next episode. Imagine this. It is the late summer of 1565. The air is thick with salt and humidity. For weeks, you've seen nothing but an endless expanse of blue ocean, the creak of the wooden ship your only constant companion. Then, one morning, a sliver of green appears on the horizon. Land. After a grueling transatlantic voyage, this isn't just any land. It's a new world, a place of myth and promise. This is Florida. On September 8, 1565, this was the reality for Pedro Menéndez de Avilés and his fleet of Spanish explorers. As their ships dropped anchor in a sheltered inlet, they weren't just making landfall. They were laying the foundation for what would become St. Augustine, the oldest continuously inhabited European established city in the continental United States. This wasn't just a landing. It was the birth of a nation's story, a story that began long before Jamestown or Plymouth Rock. So, who was this man, Pedro Menéndez, who dared to claim this wild, unknown coast for the Spanish crown? He was no mere adventurer. Menendez was a seasoned naval commander, one of Spain's most trusted and ruthless officers. King Philip II had given him a clear and urgent mission: drive out the French, who had established a small outpost called Fort Caroline nearby, and secure Florida for Spain. This wasn't just about territory. It was about control, faith, and the immense wealth of the New World. The stakes couldn't have been higher. As Menendez and his 600 soldiers and settlers waded ashore, they were met not by an empty wilderness, but by a land already home to the Timucua people. For thousands of years, the Timucua had thrived here with their own complex societies, traditions, and deep connection to the land. The arrival of these strange, armored men from across the sea marked a profound and irreversible turning point in their history. The first interactions were likely a mix of curiosity, suspicion, and cautious trade. The Spanish offered trinkets, while the Timucua provided much-needed knowledge of the local environment. But beneath this fragile peace lay a vast cultural chasm, and the foreshadowing of future conflict. The very first order of business for Menendez was survival and ceremony. He formally claimed the land for Spain in a grand ceremony, planting the royal standard in the sandy soil. A Catholic Mass was held, the first in this new settlement, led by Father Francisco López de Mendoza Grajales. Imagine the scene: Spanish soldiers in their polished armor, kneeling in the sand, giving thanks for their safe arrival while the Timucua watched from the edge of the forest, trying to make sense of these strange rituals. Menendez then shared a communal meal with the local Timucua leaders, an event that some historians have called the First Thanksgiving, predating the more famous Pilgrim feast by more than 50 years. But this new settlement, which Menendez named St. Augustine because he first sighted the coast on the feast day of St. Augustine of Hippo, was born from a sense of extreme urgency. Just up the coast, the French, who were predominantly Protestant Huguenots, represented a direct threat to Catholic Spain's dominance. Menendez knew he couldn't afford to wait. His mission was twofold: colonize and conquer. With St. Augustine established as his base, Menendez immediately turned his attention to the French at Fort Caroline. The story of what happened next is a brutal and dramatic chapter in colonial history. Despite the looming threat of hurricane season, Menendez made a bold and incredibly risky decision. He marched his troops overland through swamps and dense forests in the driving rain to launch a surprise attack on the French fort. The gamble paid off spectacularly. He caught the French completely off guard, capturing Fort Caroline with little resistance. But the story doesn't end there. A group of French sailors, whose fleet had been wrecked by a hurricane while attempting to attack St. Augustine, washed ashore south of the Spanish settlement. Exhausted and shipwrecked, they surrendered to Menendez. Here, Menendez made a ruthless calculation. He saw them not just as defeated soldiers, but as heretics and a threat to his fledgling colony. In an act that would earn the site the name matanzas, meaning slaughters in Spanish, he executed most of the French captives. It was a brutal, cold-blooded decision, but in the unforgiving context of 16th-century European rivalries, Menendez saw it as a necessary evil to secure Spain's future in Florida. With the French threat eliminated, Menendez could focus on building St. Augustine. Life in the early years was incredibly difficult. The settlers faced starvation, disease, and persistent conflict with Native American tribes who resisted Spanish encroachment. The first settlement was little more than a fortified camp, a cluster of wooden huts and a primitive fort built from earth and logs. It was a precarious foothold on a vast and hostile continent. Hurricanes repeatedly battered the coastline, destroying buildings and ships, and fires were a constant threat. Yet they endured. St. Augustine wasn't just a military outpost. It was a burgeoning community. Spanish soldiers brought their families, and the first European children were born on what would become American soil. The town plan followed a strict grid system mandated by Spanish law, with a central plaza, a church, and government buildings. This layout is still visible in the historic heart of St. Augustine today. The colony slowly grew, becoming a vital administrative and military hub for Spanish Florida, a defensive bulwark protecting the treasure fleets sailing from Mexico and South America back to Spain. The story of St. Augustine's founding is a complex tapestry woven with threads of faith, ambition, brutality, and incredible resilience. It challenges the traditional narrative of America's origins, reminding us that the story of European settlement in this country is older, more diverse, and far more complicated than we often remember. It's a story of a clash of empires, a collision of cultures, and the determined, often brutal, efforts of a few hundred people to carve out a life on the edge of a new world. The legacy of that day in September 1565 is etched into the very stones of St. Augustine. Walking through its narrow streets today, you can still feel the echoes of its Spanish past, a living testament to the adventurers who crossed an ocean and founded a city that would endure for centuries. It's a powerful reminder that history is all around us, waiting to be discovered. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into history, and share this video with anyone who loves a good story. Let me know in the comments what part of St. Augustine's history you'd like to explore next. Until then, stay curious. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we delve into a moment often overshadowed in the grand narrative of American history. A moment of profound faith and a new beginning. The very first Thanksgiving on what would become American soil. Let's set the scene. The year is 1565. The air is thick with salt and humidity on the coast of Florida. A fleet of Spanish ships, battered by the unforgiving Atlantic, has finally found safe harbor. At the heart of this expedition is a man named Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, a formidable Spanish admiral tasked by King Philip II to establish a permanent colony in La Florida. Imagine the relief washing over him and his crew of over 800 souls, sailors, soldiers, and settlers. They have survived a perilous voyage fraught with storms, uncertainty, and the threat of rival powers. Their long journey across the vast, tempestuous ocean is over. As Menendez steps from the longboat, his boots sinking into the soft white sand, he isn't met with fanfare or a welcoming committee. His first act is one of deep personal humility. He falls to his knees. In that simple, powerful gesture, he gives thanks to God. It's a moment of pure, unadulterated gratitude for their safe arrival, for deliverance from the dangers of the sea. This wasn't a political statement or a performance. It was a man overwhelmed with relief, acknowledging a higher power for his survival and the survival of his people. This moment of personal prayer quickly transitions into a communal act of faith. Following Menendez ashore is Father Francisco Lopez de Mendoza Greales, the chaplain of the expedition. Under the sprawling branches of ancient oaks, draped with Spanish moss, a makeshift altar is prepared. The sacred vestments are brought out, the cross is raised, and the familiar solemn rites begin. This wasn't just any prayer service. This was a full Catholic Mass of thanksgiving. As Father Lopez begins the liturgy, the sound of Latin chants mingles with the gentle lapping of the waves and the rustle of palmetto leaves. The weary travelers, men and women who had faced death and uncertainty, gather together. They kneel in the sand, their heads bowed, united in their shared faith and their collective sigh of relief. This event, taking place on September 8, 1565, is a cornerstone of American history. It's the first documented Christian service and the very first communal Thanksgiving feast in the continental United States. It predates the Pilgrims' famous gathering at Plymouth by more than half a century. While the later event in Massachusetts holds a special place in the American story, this earlier Thanksgiving in Florida offers a different, yet equally significant, perspective on the nation's origins. Following the Mass, something remarkable happens. Menendez extends an invitation to the local indigenous people, the Timucua, who had been watching these newcomers from a cautious distance. They are invited to join the Spaniards for a communal meal. This isn't the turkey and cranberry sauce we imagine today. The Spanish shared what they had: hardtack biscuits and a hearty stew called cocido, likely made with pork, chickpeas, and garlic, all cooked in large copper pots. The Timucua, in turn, likely brought their own local foods to the gathering, perhaps corn, beans, squash, or fresh fish. Picture the scene: two vastly different cultures, speaking different languages, sharing a meal together under the Florida sun. It's a moment of initial peace and shared humanity, a simple act of breaking bread that transcends cultural divides. It represents a brief, hopeful moment of potential cooperation and mutual respect, a testament to the universal human impulse to celebrate survival and give thanks with a shared feast. This first Thanksgiving wasn't just about giving thanks to God. It was also about fellowship with one's neighbors, however new and different they might be. The establishment of this settlement, which Menendez names to Augustine, marked the beginning of a permanent European presence in the United States. It became the oldest continuously inhabited European established city in the country. And it all began not with a battle or a proclamation of conquest, but with an act of prayer and a shared meal. It began with a day of thanksgiving. This story challenges us to broaden our understanding of American history. It reminds us that the narrative of this nation is not a single thread, but a rich and complex tapestry woven from many different cultures, faiths, and experiences. The story of Menendez and the first Thanksgiving at St. Augustine is a vital part of that tapestry. A chapter that speaks to the enduring power of faith, the resilience of the human spirit, and the simple, profound act of giving thanks. Thank you so much for joining me on this exploration of a lesser-known, yet incredibly significant moment in history. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please give this video a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the past. Hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to our journey through history. Today, in Chapter 8, we're stepping back in time, long before modern cities dotted the landscape, to meet the original inhabitants of what is now North Florida and Southeast Georgia. We're going to explore the world of the Timucua people. Who were the Timucua? The name itself actually refers to a large group of different tribes who shared a common language family. They weren't a single unified nation, but a collection of distinct communities, each with its own chief and territory spread across a vast and vibrant land. Imagine a world of dense forests, winding rivers, and sprawling marshes teeming with life. This was their home, their supermarket, and their sanctuary. So, what did the Timucua look like? Based on historical accounts and artistic depictions from the time, they were a strong and striking people. The men were often described as tall and athletic, with their long black hair tied up in a knot on top of their heads. Both men and women adorned their bodies with intricate tattoos, which were more than just decoration. They were symbols of identity, status, and personal achievements. Picture elaborate designs of animals and geometric patterns covering their arms, legs, and chests. They often wore simple clothing made from Spanish moss or deerskin, practical for the warm, humid climate. Feathers, shells, and polished stones were fashioned into beautiful jewelry, reflecting their deep appreciation for the natural world around them. The Timucua were masters of their environment. Their way of life was a beautiful dance of hunting, gathering, and agriculture. The men were skilled hunters, using powerful bows and arrows to hunt deer, turkey, and even alligators in the rivers and swamps. They were also expert fishermen, creating weirs, large, intricate fish traps made of wood and reeds to catch an abundance of fish from the local waterways. Meanwhile, the women were the heart of the community's agriculture. They cultivated fields of corn, beans, and squash, often called the Three Sisters, which formed the backbone of their diet. They would grind the corn into flour to make breads and porridges. They also gathered a wide variety of wild plants, nuts, and berries from the forest, possessing an encyclopedic knowledge of the local flora and its uses, both for food and for medicine. Their villages were well organized and often fortified with tall wooden palisades for protection. At the center of the village stood a large, circular council house, the hub of social and political life. This is where the chief and the village elders would meet to make important decisions, and where the community would gather for ceremonies and celebrations. Their homes, called chickees, were round, sturdy structures made of wooden poles, with thatched roofs of palm fronds, perfectly designed to keep them cool in the summer and dry during the rainy season. Life for the Timucua was deeply spiritual and interwoven with the land. They saw the divine in everything: the sun, the moon, the animals, and the very earth they walked upon. Their ceremonies were rich and complex, often involving music, dance, and elaborate costumes. They held a profound respect for nature, understanding that their survival depended on maintaining a delicate balance with their environment. This wasn't just a place they lived in. It was a part of them, and they were a part of it. Every river, every tree, every creature had a spirit and a story. So, you can imagine their curiosity when strange ships with giant white sails appeared on the horizon. These newcomers, the Europeans, looked different, spoke a language they didn't understand, and carried objects they had never seen before. The Timucua, being a confident and established people, approached these strangers with a mix of caution and intrigue. They were curious about their tools, their clothing, and their intentions. Initially, there were instances of trade and exchange, as two vastly different worlds collided for the first time on these shores. The Timucua weren't a primitive people waiting to be discovered. They were a sophisticated and resilient society with a rich culture, a complex social structure, and a deep, enduring connection to their ancestral lands. They had built a thriving world here over centuries, a world that was in perfect harmony with the natural rhythms of the Florida landscape. Understanding the Timucua is essential to understanding the full story of this region. They are the foundational chapter, the first people who called this beautiful, wild place home. Their legacy is etched into the land itself in the names of rivers and places that still echo their language, and in the archaeological sites that offer us a precious glimpse into their lost world. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the lives of the Timucua people. It's a powerful reminder of the rich and diverse cultures that existed long before our time. If you found this fascinating, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more historical journeys, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. Imagine stepping back in time, over 500 years ago, to a world untouched by the one you know. This is Florida, a land of dense green forests, sparkling rivers, and a people who have lived in harmony with it for centuries, the Timucua. And on the horizon, something new appears. Strange ships, with giant white sails like clouds, glide silently towards the shore. This is the meeting of two worlds, a moment suspended in time, filled with a quiet, cautious curiosity. The men who step off these ships are unlike anyone the Timucua have ever seen. They're covered in gleaming metal that flashes in the sun and clad in strange, heavy fabrics. Their faces are covered in hair, and they speak a language that sounds like the rustling of dry leaves. These are the Spanish explorers, thousands of miles from their homes, stepping into a world they can barely comprehend. There's no roar of cannons, no clash of swords. Instead, a profound silence hangs in the humid air, thick with unspoken questions. Who are you? Where do you come from? Are you friend or foe? The Timucua, watching from the edge of the forest, are tall and strong. Their skin is painted with intricate designs of red, black, and white, symbols of their clans and their connection to the natural world. They are adorned with feathers, shells, and polished stones. They carry bows and arrows, not as a threat, but as a part of their daily life. They watch the newcomers with a mixture of awe and apprehension. These strangers are so different, yet they are still men with 2 arms, 2 legs, and eyes that hold the same spark of curiosity as their own. One of the Timucua leaders, perhaps a chief adorned with a magnificent headdress of heron feathers, takes a brave step forward. He holds his hands open, a universal sign of peace. He is not alone. His people stand with him, their faces a mix of watchfulness and intrigue. On the other side, a Spanish captain, maybe weighed down by both his armor and the responsibility of his mission, sees the gesture. He understands. He raises his own hand in return. In this simple, silent exchange, a bridge is built across a vast ocean of cultural difference. The first words are not spoken, but shown. A Spanish explorer might hold up a small, shining mirror. To him it's a simple trinket. But to a Timucua warrior who has only ever seen his reflection in the still water of a pond, it's magic. He sees his own painted face, his surprised eyes, and a smile slowly spreads across his lips. In return, the Timucua chief might offer a beautifully woven basket filled with corn, beans, and squash, the bounty of their land, a symbol of their hospitality and their mastery of agriculture. A child, braver than the adults, might dart forward and touch the strange, rough wool of a soldier's tunic, then quickly retreat, giggling. A Spaniard might offer the child a small brass bell, its tiny jingle a sound never before heard in this forest. These aren't grand negotiations or political treaties. They are small human moments. The sharing of food, the exchange of simple gifts, the universal language of a smile. They are communicating through gestures, pointing at the sun, the sky, the trees, trying to find common ground. The Spanish marvel at the intricate tattoos and piercings of the Timucua, works of art worn on the skin. The Timucua are fascinated by the Spaniards' beards, their metal helmets, and the magnificent, powerful horses that stand patiently on the beach, creatures of a size and strength they have never imagined. Each side is a living museum to the other, a puzzle to be solved not with force, but with observation and tentative interaction. They might share a meal. The Spanish, used to hardtack and salted meat, would taste fresh roasted fish, sweet fruits, and unfamiliar vegetables for the first time. The Timucua, in turn, might cautiously sample the hard salty bread of the sailors. In this brief, gentle moment of peace there is hope. It's a glimpse of what could be a testament to our shared humanity. Before the conflicts, before the misunderstandings and the tragedies that would follow, there was this day. A day of quiet wonder on a sun-drenched Florida beach. It's a reminder that the first instinct of humanity, when faced with the unknown, doesn't have to be fear or aggression. It can be curiosity, it can be an open hand. It can be the simple, powerful act of seeing another person, no matter how different, and recognizing a shared desire to understand. This was the first chapter, written not with ink and quill, but with gestures, gifts, and smiles. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey back in time. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more explorations into the forgotten corners of history. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. Imagine this. The year is 1565, not 1621. We're not in Plymouth, Massachusetts, but in St. Augustine, Florida. The air is warm, humid, filled with the sounds of the Atlantic coast. The formalities are over, the Mass has concluded, the cannons have fired, and now, 2 vastly different cultures are about to do something profoundly human. They are about to share a meal. This, my friends, is the story of the true first Thanksgiving. Forget everything you think you know about pilgrims and turkeys. This was a gathering born not of a planned harvest festival, but of survival, relief, and a cautious curiosity. On one side, you have the Spanish, led by Pedro Menéndez de Avilés. They've just endured a treacherous, storm-tossed voyage across the Atlantic. They are exhausted, hungry, and grateful just to be on solid ground. On the other side, you have the Timucua, the native people of this land. They are watching these strange newcomers, wary but also intrigued. They've seen ships before, but this is different. This group is here to stay. Menendez, a shrewd and devout man, understands the importance of this moment. He knows that establishing a peaceful relationship with the local inhabitants is crucial for the survival of his new colony. A settlement he has just named St. Augustine, so he extends an invitation. Not with a formal decree, but with a simple, universal gesture of peace. Come, eat with us. The Timucua, led by their chief, Seloy, accept. It's a moment of quiet diplomacy, a fragile truce brokered not with words, but with the promise of food. So what's on the menu at this historic potluck? The Spanish bring what they have, the rations that sustain them across the ocean. The star of their contribution is a dish called cocido. This is a hearty, rustic stew, the ultimate comfort food for a weary Spaniard. Picture a large pot simmering over an open fire, filled with salted pork preserved for the long journey and garbanzo beans, what we call chickpeas today. It's thick, it's savory, and it's packed with calories. Alongside the cocido, they have coarse, hard biscuits known as ship's bread or hardtack. This isn't your fluffy dinner roll. It's a dense, durable cracker designed to last for months at sea. It's practical, not gourmet, but to these starving sailors, it's a feast. Perhaps there was some red wine, a staple of any Spanish voyage, adding a touch of a European flavor to this wild Florida shore. Now, what about the Timucua? They are the hosts, after all, and they bring the bounty of their land. Their contribution is a vibrant contrast to the preserved foods of the Spanish. Imagine them offering freshly harvested corn, a sacred and essential crop. Maybe it's roasted over the fire, its sweet aroma mixing with the salty smell of the pork stew. They might have brought wild fruits gathered from the surrounding forests, berries, persimmons, and maybe even wild grapes. And for the main course, it's highly likely they offered venison. The Timucua were skilled hunters, and roasted deer would have been a prized offering, a true taste of the richness of Florida. You might also find oysters, clams, or fish, smoked or grilled, pulled fresh from the nearby waters. So you have this incredible fusion of flavors and cultures. On one plate, you have the old world and the new, salty, preserved pork next to freshly roasted venison. Hard, dry ship's bread used to scoop up sweet, tender corn. It's a meal of contrasts, a culinary symbol of the encounter taking place. There are no tables, no fine silverware. People are sitting on the ground, on logs, using their hands or simple wooden utensils. The language barrier is immense. Communication is done through smiles, gestures, and the shared act of eating. A nod of appreciation for a piece of roasted fish. A Spaniard showing a Timucuan how to dip the hardtack into the stew to soften it. This wasn't a loud, boisterous celebration like the Thanksgiving we imagine today. It was likely a much more subdued and cautious affair. Think of it as a quiet feast. There's a sense of wonder and uncertainty in the air. The Spanish are observing the Timucua, their customs, their clothing, their language. The Timucua are doing the same, studying these pale men with their strange armor and their unfamiliar food. Each bite is an exploration, each shared portion a small step towards understanding. It's in these quiet moments, amidst the chewing and the sharing, that the first real connections are made. This meal, this simple act of breaking bread together, was far more significant than just satisfying hunger. For the Spanish, it was a strategic move to secure peace and ensure the initial survival of their fledgling colony. For the Timucua, it was an opportunity to assess these newcomers, to gauge their intentions. Was this an act of genuine friendship or a temporary truce? History, of course, tells us that this relationship was complex and would eventually become tragic for the Timucua people. But in this single moment, on that September day in 1565, there was a glimmer of hope. There was a shared humanity. When we think of Thanksgiving, we should remember this day. It's a story that reminds us that American history is deeper, more complex, and more diverse than the popular narratives we're often told. It's a story of encounter, of survival, and of the simple, powerful act of sharing a meal. It was a day of quiet gratitude on the shores of Florida, a moment of peace between two worlds, the true first Thanksgiving. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more hidden histories. Let me know in the comments what you think. Did you know about the St. Augustine Thanksgiving? See you in the next video. 0 o'clock to 0:15. Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Close your eyes for a second and picture Thanksgiving dinner. What do you see? A giant golden brown turkey, right? Fluffy mashed potatoes, gooey green bean casserole, and a big slice of pumpkin pie with whipped cream. It's a beautiful picture, but what if I told you that the very first Thanksgiving feast looked and tasted completely different? 0:15:0:45. Today, we're going to travel back in time not just to see what they ate, but to taste it, to smell it, to feel the warmth of that historic meal. Let's leave our modern menu behind and explore the true flavors of that 1621 harvest celebration. It was a fascinating blend of two worlds, the familiar tastes of England and the incredible bounty of a new land. Forget what you think you know, because we're about to uncover a culinary story that's so much richer and more interesting. 0:45:1:30, so let's start with the star of the show. Was there turkey? Absolutely. But it wasn't the only bird on the menu. The Wampanoag, who were masters of this land, brought at least 5 deer to the feast. Imagine the smell of venison roasting over an open fire, the meat sizzling, seasoned simply with salt and maybe some wild herbs. Alongside that, you'd find a flock of wildfowl. We're talking ducks, geese, and swans, their rich dark meat a far cry from the domesticated turkey we know today. These birds were cooked over coals or boiled in stews, their natural gamey flavors shining through. 1:32:15. The English Pilgrims brought their own culinary traditions with them. They loved savory pies and potages, which are thick, hearty stews. So picture a large cauldron bubbling over the fire. Inside, pieces of duck, goose, and maybe some eel are simmering away with onions and herbs brought from England, like thyme, parsley, and sage. The aroma would have been incredible, a mix of savory meat and earthy herbs, mingling with the wood smoke. It wasn't about a single centerpiece. It was a communal pot, a shared experience of abundance. 2:15:03. Now, let's talk about the seafood. Remember, Plymouth was right on the coast. The waters were teeming with life. The feast would have been loaded with cod, bass, and eel, either smoked to preserve them or cooked fresh over the flames. And don't forget the shellfish! Mounds of lobster, clams, and mussels would have been steamed in seaweed-lined pits right on the beach. Imagine pulling a sweet, tender piece of lobster meat from its shell, tasting the slight brininess of the ocean. This was a true clam bake, a celebration of the sea's generosity. 3:00 to 3:45. So we have all this incredible protein, but what about the side dishes? This is where the fusion of cultures really gets delicious. Forget mashed potatoes. Potatoes hadn't made their way to North America yet. Instead, the main starch was corn, or as the Wampanoag called it, maize. This wasn't the sweet yellow corn we eat off the cob. It was flint corn with kernels as hard as stone. The native women would have spent hours grinding it into a coarse meal. 3:45:4:30. From this cornmeal, they created amazing dishes. One staple was a thick porridge or polenta-like dish called nasomp. Imagine a warm, comforting bowl of coarsely ground corn, maybe sweetened with a drizzle of maple syrup or flavored with dried berries. It was the ultimate comfort food. They also made a type of cornbread, but it wasn't the fluffy, cake-like bread we know. It was more like a dense, flat patty cooked on a hot stone or in the embers of the fire with a smoky, nutty flavor. 4:35:15. What other vegetables were there? You'd find the three sisters corn, beans, and squash working together in harmony. Stews would feature different kinds of beans, adding protein and texture, and the squash. There were so many varieties we don't often see today. Instead of a sweet pumpkin pie, you'd find pumpkins and other squashes roasted whole in the fire's ashes until they were soft and caramelized. Imagine scooping out the sweet, tender flesh, its natural sugars concentrated by the heat. It was dessert and a side dish all in one. 5:15:06. Let's talk about the flavors and spices. The Pilgrims had a limited supply of spices from Europe, maybe some cinnamon, nutmeg, and ginger. But the real flavor enhancers came from the landscape. They would have used wild onions and garlic, foraged greens for salads, and nuts like chestnuts, walnuts, and beech nuts, which could be roasted or ground into flour. And the sweetener wasn't white sugar. It was the liquid gold of the New England forest, maple syrup. This gave a unique, earthy sweetness to many of the dishes. 6:00 to 6:45, so let's put it all together and contrast it with today. Our modern Thanksgiving is often about sweetness and richness. Sweet potato casserole with marshmallows, cranberry sauce from a can that's basically jelly, and pies loaded with sugar. The 1621 meal was fundamentally different. It was savory, smoky, and earthy. The sweetness was natural, coming from roasted squash or a touch of maple. The richness came from wild game and fish, not from butter and cream. 6:45-7:30. Think about the textures. Instead of smooth, creamy mashed potatoes, you have the hearty, slightly gritty texture of nasomp. Instead of soft dinner rolls, you have a dense, smoky cornbread. Instead of a single perfectly roasted turkey, you have a variety of meats, each with its own unique flavor profile, cooked in different ways, roasted, boiled, and smoked. It was a meal that engaged all your senses in a much more rustic, direct way. 7:38-15. And what about pumpkin pie? Well, they had the pumpkin, but they didn't have the butter, flour, and sugar to make a crust. A more likely dessert would have been a hollowed-out pumpkin filled with milk, honey or maple syrup, and spices, then roasted in the hot ashes. It would have been more like a warm, spiced pumpkin custard. Delicious and comforting, but a world away from the slice of pie we expect. 8:15-9 o'clock. This meal was less about individual, perfected recipes and more about communal cooking in shared abundance. It was a true harvest festival, celebrating the ingredients that were available right then and there. It was a meal born of cooperation, necessity, and gratitude. The flavors were a direct reflection of the land and the season, the smokiness of the fire, the saltiness of the sea, the earthiness of the crops, and the wild, untamed taste of the forest. 9 o'clock, 9:45. So next time you sit down for your Thanksgiving dinner, take a moment to appreciate the history behind it. While you're enjoying your turkey and pumpkin pie, maybe you can also imagine the scent of wood smoke, the taste of fire-roasted venison, and the comforting warmth of a bowl of corn porridge. The first Thanksgiving wasn't just a meal. It was a sensory experience, a blend of cultures, and a taste of a world that was both challenging and incredibly generous. It's a story worth remembering and savoring. 9:45-10 o'clock. Thank you so much for joining me on this culinary journey back in time. I hope it gave you a new perspective on this special holiday. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the stories behind our food. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone! Welcome back to our journey through history. Today, in Chapter 12, we're exploring a concept we all know, but through a very different lens: gratitude. We're heading back to the year 1565, to a time and place where giving thanks looked nothing like our modern Thanksgiving holiday. Picture this. It's September 8, 1565. Hundreds of Spanish settlers, led by Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, have just endured a treacherous, storm-tossed voyage across the vast Atlantic. They've landed on the sandy shores of what is now St. Augustine, Florida. They are exhausted, probably a little scared, but overwhelmingly, they are alive. Before they even finish building their first structures, before the settlement truly takes shape, what is the very first thing they do? They hold a massive Thanksgiving. This wasn't about turkey and stuffing, it was a deeply spiritual act. For these Spanish colonists, gratitude wasn't a once-a-year holiday. It was an immediate, visceral response to survival. Their journey had been perilous. They faced the constant threat of storms that could swallow their ships whole, the specter of disease that could sweep through the crowded decks, and the simple, gnawing uncertainty of a voyage into the unknown. Every sunrise on calm waters, every day without a major catastrophe, was seen as a sign of divine favor. Their safe arrival wasn't just good luck. In their eyes, it was a miracle. It was tangible proof of divine protection. So this first act of thanks was directed upward. It was a solemn, sacred moment of acknowledging a higher power that had guided them safely through the ocean's fury and delivered them to this new land. The meal that followed, which they shared with the local Timucua people, was an extension of this religious ceremony. It wasn't the main event. It was the communal expression of that initial, holy gratitude. The food they ate was likely a simple stew made from salted pork and garbanzo beans, supplemented with whatever the Timucua offered, like fish, corn, or squash. This event in St. Augustine predates the Pilgrims' famous 1621 feast by a full 56 years. Yet, it's often overlooked in our popular narrative of Thanksgiving. Why? Perhaps because it challenges our modern, secularized idea of the holiday. For us, Thanksgiving is often centered on family, football, and feasting. It's a cherished tradition, but its spiritual roots have, for many, faded into the background. In 1565, gratitude wasn't a feeling you saved for a designated Thursday in November. It was woven into the fabric of daily life, especially when faced with life or death situations. It was a conversation with the divine. When Menendez and his people knelt on that Florida beach, they weren't just happy to be on solid ground. They were performing an act of profound spiritual devotion, thanking God for their very lives. This meal was less of a harvest festival and more of a testament to their faith and their belief that they had been personally shielded from harm. Let's contrast that with the Pilgrims at Plymouth in 1621. While their feast also had religious undertones, it was more directly tied to a successful harvest. After a brutal first winter that wiped out half their population, a good harvest was, quite literally, the difference between life and death for the coming year. Their gratitude was tied to the tangible bounty of the earth, a reward for their hard labor and a promise of survival. The Spanish celebration, however, was focused on the journey itself. It was about giving thanks for safe passage. Think about it, they had survived the most dangerous part of their endeavor. The challenges of building a colony still lay ahead, but the immediate peril of the sea was behind them. Their gratitude was for deliverance. This perspective shift is fascinating. It asks us to consider what we are truly thankful for. Is it for the things we have, or is it for the dangers we have overcome? In 1565, for these settlers, it was unequivocally the latter. Their gratitude was born from peril, shaped by faith, and expressed through sacred ritual. The act of sharing this meal with the Timucua people adds another layer. While the relationship between Europeans and Native Americans would become fraught with conflict, in this initial moment, there was a shared humanity. The Spanish, in their moment of profound thanks, extended an invitation. The Timucua, likely curious about these newcomers, accepted. It was a brief, hopeful instance of cross-cultural interaction, centered around the universal human act of sharing a meal. By understanding this earlier Thanksgiving, we gain a richer, more complex view of American history. We see that the impulse to give thanks upon reaching this continent was not a singular event but a recurring theme. And we are reminded that for centuries, gratitude was, first and foremost, a spiritual act, a humble acknowledgement of forces greater than oneself. It was a recognition that survival itself was the greatest gift of all. So, as we think about our own traditions, it's worth remembering that first gathering on a Florida beach. It wasn't about abundance in the way we think of it now. It was about the simple, powerful, and profound gratitude for having made it. It was thanks for safe passage, for a new beginning, and for the divine protection that they believed had brought them to a new land. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into a lesser-known chapter of our history. It's a powerful reminder of the many forms gratitude can take. If you enjoyed this exploration and want to uncover more hidden stories from the past, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We have so much more to discover together. See you next time. Hello and welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we're diving into Chapter 13, Building St. Augustine. After the dramatic events we've already covered, Pedro Menéndez de Avilés wasn't just resting on his laurels. He had a mission from the King of Spain to establish a permanent, thriving Spanish foothold in La Florida. This wasn't just about claiming land. It was about building a future. So, how do you build a city from scratch in a new, unfamiliar world? For Menendez and his colonists, the work began immediately. The very first structure they focused on was a fort. This makes perfect sense, right? Security was paramount. They weren't just worried about potential attacks from rival European powers like the French, but also navigating relationships with the local Timucua people. The initial fort wasn't a grand stone castle like the Castillo de San Marcos we see today. No, it was a much more practical, hastily built structure. They used what was readily available, earth and wood. They dug trenches, threw up earthen ramparts, and likely used logs to create a palisade wall. This was a fort born of necessity, a simple but vital defensive ring around their fledgling settlement. It was their shield against the unknown. Inside this protective enclosure, life began to take shape. The next priority was a place of worship. Remember, this was a deeply religious expedition. Faith was the bedrock of their society and their mission. So, a simple chapel was constructed. Again, think rustic. It would have been a humble wooden building, perhaps with a thatched roof made from local palms. But within its simple walls, the colonists could gather for Mass, find spiritual comfort, and mark the rhythms of their lives with familiar ceremonies. It was the heart of the new community, a symbol that this was not just a military outpost, but a Spanish Catholic town in the making. With the fort for protection and the chapel for spiritual guidance, the focus shifted to shelter. The colonists needed homes. The first houses were far from the Spanish-style architecture we now associate with St. Augustine. They were more like primitive huts, what the Spanish called asterisk bohayos. They likely borrowed building techniques from the Timucua, using wooden posts for frames and weaving palm fronds for roofs and walls. These structures were quick to build and provided essential shelter from the hot Florida sun and sudden downpours. It was a challenging existence. Imagine leaving a stone house in Spain for a palm-thatched hut in a humid, mosquito-filled land. It took incredible resilience. Menendez was a skilled and determined leader. He laid out a plan for the town, designating areas for these homes, the church and government buildings. It was a grid, a classic Spanish colonial town plan, even in its most basic form. He wasn't just building for the present. He was laying the foundation for a permanent city. He knew that for the colony to succeed, it needed more than just soldiers. It needed families, farmers, and artisans. He encouraged his men to work the land, to plant crops they brought from Spain and the Caribbean, and to learn what local foods could be cultivated. They had to become self-sufficient and fast. But the early years were incredibly tough. This wasn't a peaceful construction project. St. Augustine was born in conflict and had to fight for its survival from day one. The settlement had to be moved several times in its early years due to threats. There were mutinies among the soldiers who were often unpaid and unhappy with the harsh conditions. Food shortages were a constant threat. The supply ships from Spain were unreliable, and a hurricane could wipe out their local crops in an instant. And then there were the pirates. The Caribbean was a hotbed of piracy, and St. Augustine, as a Spanish outpost, was a tempting target. In 1586, the famous English privateer Sir Francis Drake sailed up the coast. He saw the small, vulnerable settlement and attacked. His forces overwhelmed the defenders, looted the town, and burned it to the ground. The fort, the chapel, the homes all went up in flames. It was a devastating blow. For many colonies, this would have been the end, but St. Augustine was different. The survivors, with that same grit and determination that Menendez had instilled, refused to give up. They rebuilt. This cycle of destruction and rebirth would become a defining characteristic of the city's history. Over the next century, it would face more pirate attacks, more devastating storms, and the constant threat of conflict with English colonies growing to the north in Carolina and Georgia. Each time the city was knocked down, it got back up, often stronger than before. The wooden forts were eventually replaced by more substantial structures, culminating in the magnificent Coquina stone fortress, the Castillo de San Marcos, which began construction in 1672. This mighty fort would prove to be the key to the city's long-term survival, withstanding multiple sieges. Through all these trials, through wars, storms, and pirate raids, the people of St. Augustine endured. They held on. And in doing so, they created something truly remarkable. That small, fragile settlement of wooden huts and earthen forts, born from the ambition of Pedro Menéndez, survived against all odds. It grew, it changed, but it never disappeared. And that is its legacy. St. Augustine stands today not just as a beautiful historic city, but as a testament to human resilience. It is the oldest continuously inhabited European established city in the United States, a living link to the very beginning of the European story in North America. The story of its construction is not just about wood and stone. It's about the unyielding spirit of the people who refused to let their city die. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the building of St. Augustine. It's a story of incredible hardship and even more incredible perseverance. If you enjoyed this video and want to continue exploring the fascinating corners of history with us, please hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss our next chapter. We'll see you next time. Alright, let's turn the clock back a few centuries. Forget the grand sweeping histories for a moment and focus on a story many of us learned as kids. We're heading to the year 1620. A small battered ship called the Mayflower, tossed by the unforgiving Atlantic for over 2 months, finally spots land. On board are about 100 souls, a mix of religious separatists we call the Pilgrims and other adventurers, all seeking a new life. They weren't aiming for what we now know as Massachusetts. Their patent was for Virginia, much farther south. But storms blew them off course, and with winter closing in, they had to make a tough decision. They anchored in what would become Plymouth Harbor, a place far from any English settlement, a world completely unknown to them. Before they even set foot on shore, they drafted a document that would become legendary, the Mayflower Compact. It was a radical idea for its time, a simple agreement to form a civil body politic and create just and equal laws. It was a social contract, a promise to govern themselves. This wasn't about a king or a distant government. It was about survival and creating a community from scratch, bound by mutual consent. It was a tiny seed of self-governance planted on a cold, windswept shore. That first winter was brutal, absolutely devastating. The settlers were unprepared for the harsh New England climate. They lived aboard the Mayflower while building crude shelters on land. Scurvy, pneumonia, and other diseases swept through their ranks. By the time spring arrived, nearly half of them, almost half the passengers and crew had perished. Imagine the scene: a small, grieving community, weakened and demoralized, surrounded by a wilderness they didn't understand. Their dream of a new beginning was on the brink of becoming a nightmare, but then something incredible happened. In March of 1621, a Native American man walked boldly into their struggling settlement and greeted them in English. His name was Samoset. He had learned the language from English fishermen who had been visiting the coast for years. This encounter was a turning point. Samoset soon returned with another man to Squantum, or Squanto, as he's more famously known. Squanto's story is one of the most incredible tales in American history. He was a member of the Patuxet tribe, which had lived right where the Pilgrims had settled. Years earlier, he had been kidnapped by an English explorer, taken to Spain, sold into slavery, escaped to London, and finally managed to find his way back to his homeland, only to discover that his entire tribe had been wiped out by a plague, likely brought by European traders. Imagine his position, returning home to find only ghosts, and then a new group of English people settling on his ancestral land. He could have chosen revenge. He could have chosen hatred. Instead, Squanto chose to help. He saw these struggling newcomers and perhaps saw a chance for a new kind of community. He became their interpreter, their guide, and their teacher. He taught them how to cultivate the native corn, showing them the crucial technique of fertilizing the soil with fish. He taught them which plants were safe to eat and which were poisonous. He showed them where to fish and how to hunt. He was quite literally the key to their survival. Without Squanto, the Plymouth colony almost certainly would have failed. He also helped broker a peace treaty between the Pilgrims and the local Wampanoag tribe, led by their sachem, Massasoit. This alliance was mutually beneficial. The Pilgrims needed allies to survive, and the Wampanoag, weakened by the same plague that destroyed the Patuxet, needed allies to defend against rival tribes. After that first successful harvest in the autumn of 1621, a harvest made possible by the Wampanoag's guidance, the Pilgrims were filled with gratitude. Governor William Bradford declared a celebration to give thanks for their bounty and their survival. They invited Massasoit and his people to join them. Now, this is the event we think of as the first Thanksgiving, but it probably didn't look much like the pictures in our elementary school textbooks. It was a 3-day festival of feasting, diplomacy, and games. About 90 Wampanoag men arrived, nearly outnumbering the 50 or so surviving colonists. They didn't just show up as guests. They contributed to the feast, bringing 5 deer they had hunted. The menu was a true blend of cultures: venison, wildfowl, likely turkey, but also ducks and geese along with corn, squash, and other local foods. It was less a formal dinner and more of a harvest festival, a moment of shared relief and cautious optimism between two very different cultures. For the Pilgrims, it was a profound moment of giving thanks to God for seeing them through an impossible year. For the Wampanoag, it was a continuation of their own long-standing traditions of celebrating the harvest, while also solidifying a critical political alliance. For 3 days, they ate. They competed in shooting and athletic contests, and they reaffirmed the peace that had allowed both groups to coexist. Here's the interesting part, though. After that event in 1621, it wasn't really a big deal. It wasn't an annual holiday. Days of Thanksgiving were common in both European and native cultures, but they were usually solemn religious observances or spontaneous celebrations, not a set date on the calendar. That 1621 feast was a one-time event, a unique moment in history that was largely forgotten for the next 200 years. So how did it become the national holiday we know today? The story lay dormant in the personal journals of the Pilgrims, like William Bradford's of Plymouth Plantation. It wasn't until the 19th century that these documents were rediscovered and published. A magazine editor named Sarah Josepha Hale, the same woman who wrote Mary Had a Little Lamb, read the story and was captivated. She saw in it a beautiful unifying origin story for a nation that was being torn apart by deep divisions. Divisions that would eventually lead to the Civil War. For decades, Hale campaigned tirelessly, writing editorials and sending letters to presidents, urging them to declare a national day of thanksgiving. She envisioned a day that would bring families together and unite the country around a shared, peaceful narrative. Finally, in 1863, in the midst of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln issued a proclamation declaring the last Thursday in November as a national day of thanksgiving. He hoped it would help heal the wounds of the nation. He drew on the Pilgrim story, transforming that 1621 harvest feast from a forgotten historical event into a foundational American myth. It became a symbol of gratitude, perseverance, and, ideally, peaceful coexistence. So the holiday you and I celebrate is really a 19th century invention, inspired by a 17th century event. It's a story layered with history, hardship, and hope. It's a story of survival, of unlikely friendships, and of how we, as a nation, choose to remember our past. Thanks so much for watching and exploring this history with me. If you enjoyed this journey back in time, please hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories behind the history we think we know. See you in the next video. Have you ever wondered why, when we talk about American history, the story usually starts with Jamestown in 1607 or the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock in 1620? It's a great story, but it's like starting a movie 20 minutes in. Today, we're going to rewind and uncover a massive, vibrant chapter of American history that was largely forgotten, deliberately ignored, and almost erased. We're talking about Spanish Florida, a European settlement that existed decades before the English ever arrived. And we're going to ask a crucial question: how can a place so important just disappear from our collective memory? The answer, as you'll see, has everything to do with two powerful forces that have shaped our world for centuries: religion and language. Let's set the stage. Long before the Mayflower set sail, the Spanish were already here. In 1565, they founded St. Augustine in what is now Florida. That's a full 42 years before Jamestown. St. Augustine wasn't just a temporary camp. It was a permanent, thriving European city on North American soil. It had forts, churches, farms, and a diverse population. The Spanish Empire had a massive head start in the Americas. They were building a new world, complete with its own culture, administration, and faith. So why isn't St. Augustine the starting point of every American history textbook? To understand this, we need to travel across the Atlantic to 16th century Europe. The continent was in the midst of a massive religious upheaval, the Protestant Reformation. This wasn't just a theological debate. It was a political, cultural, and military firestorm. On one side, you had the traditional Catholic powers, led by mighty Spain. On the other, you had emerging Protestant nations, most notably England. This conflict wasn't confined to Europe. It spilled over into the New World, turning North America into a new front in an old war. For the English settlers who came later, the Spanish weren't just rivals for land and resources. They were religious adversaries. The English were overwhelmingly Protestant, and they viewed the Spanish, who were devoutly Catholic, with deep suspicion and hostility. In their eyes, the Spanish were papists, loyal to a foreign pope, and their entire colonial project was seen as an extension of Catholic idolatry and tyranny. This wasn't just background noise, it was a core part of their identity and worldview. When the English began establishing their own colonies along the Atlantic coast, they didn't see themselves as joining a pre-existing European colonial story. They saw themselves as starting a new, better one. They were building a city upon a hill, a beacon of Protestant virtue in a wilderness they believed was tainted by Catholic Spain. This is where the first layer of forgetting begins. The English settlers had no interest in preserving the history of their Spanish rivals. Why would they? They weren't going to tell tales of brave Spanish conquistadors or dedicated Catholic missionaries. Instead, they told their own stories. They wrote their own histories. And in those histories, the Spanish were often cast as the villains, cruel, greedy, and despotic. The infamous Black Legend, a propaganda campaign that exaggerated Spanish brutalities in the New World, was a powerful tool. It helped justify English expansion and painted their own colonial efforts as more humane and divinely favored. So the stories of Spanish Florida, the accounts of its people, its struggles, and its achievements simply weren't passed down through the dominant English-speaking culture. The oral traditions, the written records, the very memory of what happened in Florida and the broader Spanish territories were filtered out. It's like a family that refuses to talk about a certain relative. Over time, that relative's story fades and eventually disappears from the family's history. This brings us to the second major factor: language. As the 13 colonies grew, rebelled, and formed the United States, the dominant language and culture became English. The nation's identity was forged in English. Its laws, its literature, and, most importantly for our story, its history books were all written in English. Now, think about the job of a historian in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Where do they look for source material? Naturally, they turn to archives and documents written in a language they can read. American historians, trained in an English-speaking tradition, focused overwhelmingly on English-language sources. They pored over the records from Jamestown, the diaries of Puritan leaders, and the official documents of the British colonial administration. These were the building blocks they used to construct the narrative of America. The Spanish archives, filled with hundreds of thousands of documents detailing a century of life in North America, were largely sitting in Spain and Mexico. They were written in Spanish, a language many American historians at the time couldn't read. Accessing them was difficult, and translating them was a monumental task. It was simply easier to build the story from the readily available English materials. This wasn't necessarily a malicious conspiracy to erase Spanish history. It was a matter of convenience and cultural bias. The narrative that emerged naturally centered on the English experience because that's what the storytellers knew. It created a powerful and persistent feedback loop. The history books focused on the English colonies, so that's what was taught in schools. Students grew up with this version of history, and some of them became the next generation of historians, who then continued to focus on the same narrative. The story of America became synonymous with the story of Anglo-America. The consequences of this historical amnesia are profound. It gives us a skewed understanding of our own country. It makes it seem as if American history is a simple, linear story of English settlement expanding westward. But the reality is so much richer and more complex. The United States didn't just grow from English roots. It was also shaped by Spanish, French, Dutch, and of course, hundreds of indigenous cultures that were here long before anyone else. Florida's story is the perfect example. Before it was American, it was Spanish, then British, then Spanish again. It was a melting pot of cultures: Spanish soldiers, Minorcan immigrants, enslaved Africans who sought freedom under Spanish law, and various Native American tribes. This multicultural reality was happening in Florida long before the idea of an American melting pot ever took hold in the English colonies. Forgetting this chapter means we miss the fact that the early struggle for North America was a three-way contest, not just a two-way one. It wasn't just Europeans versus Native Americans. It was English versus Spanish versus French, all while navigating complex relationships with dozens of powerful indigenous nations. Ignoring the Spanish presence flattens this dynamic and robs us of a more accurate and fascinating picture of our past. So, when we ask why Florida was forgotten, the answer is clear. It was a casualty of a centuries-old religious conflict and the victim of a linguistic divide. The story of Catholic Spanish-speaking Florida didn't fit the narrative being built by Protestant, English-speaking America, so it was set aside. It wasn't that the history didn't exist. It was that the storytellers chose not to tell it. They focused on their own ancestors, their own language, and their own heroes. Thankfully, over the last few decades, historians have been working hard to correct this. They are diving into the Spanish archives, translating the documents, and piecing together this lost chapter of American history. They are reminding us that the American story didn't begin in 1607 or 1620. It began much earlier, under a different flag, with a different language and a different faith on the sunny shores of Florida. Understanding this doesn't diminish the story of Jamestown or Plymouth. It enriches it, giving us a fuller, more truthful, and far more interesting account of who we are and how we got here. Thank you so much for joining me on this historical deep dive. If you found this fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe for more forgotten histories. Let me know in the comments what other overlooked chapters of history you'd like to explore. Until next time, stay curious.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into a story that rewrites a cornerstone of American history. We all grew up with the story of the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag, sharing a harvest feast at Plymouth Inn, 1621. It is a powerful image, etched into our national identity as the first Thanksgiving. But what if I told you that the first documented Thanksgiving feast by Europeans on American soil happened 56 years earlier? And it wasn't in Mass. Get ready, because we're traveling back to 1565, to the sun-drenched coast of Florida, to rediscover a forgotten feast. Our story begins, not with the Mayflower, but with a fleet of Spanish ships, led by an admiral named Pedro Menéndez. He was under orders from King Philip II of Spain to establish a permanent colony in La Florida. After a treacherous journey across the Atlantic, Menendez and his 800 colonist men, women, and children finally spotted land. On September 8, 1565, they disembarked onto the shores of what is now St. Augustine, Florida. The first thing they did was hold a Mass of Thanksgiving. This wasn't a harvest festival. It was a religious ceremony to thank God for their safe arrival. The fleet's chaplain, Father Francisco Lopez de Mendoza Grials, presided over the service. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of weary but grateful Spaniards, dressed in their 16th century attire, kneeling on the sand, giving thanks for surviving the perilous voyage. This act alone marks a significant moment. A formal Christian service of thanks on American soil decades before the Pilgrims even left Europe. But the story doesn't end with the Mass. What happened next is truly remarkable. After the religious service, Admiral Menendez ordered that a meal be prepared for everyone. He then extended an invitation to the local indigenous people, the Saloy tribe of the Timucua nation, who had been watching the newcomers from a distance. The Timucua were wary but curious, and they accepted the invitation. So, what was on the menu at this first Thanksgiving? It was a far cry from the turkey and cranberry sauce we picture today. The Spaniards brought out the best of their remaining ship's rations. The main dish was a stew called cocido, made from salted pork, garbanzo beans, and seasoned with garlic and olive oil, all cooked together in a large pot. They would have also had hard sea biscuits and, of course, red wine. The Timucua, in turn, likely brought contributions from their own harvest. Perhaps corn, beans, squash, or fresh fish, oysters, and game from the local area. It was a true potluck, a blend of old world and new world foods, shared in a spirit of communion. This event was a communal meal of shared gratitude and diplomacy between two vastly different cultures. The Spanish were celebrating their safe arrival and the founding of St. Augustine, the nation's oldest continuously inhabited European established city. The Timucua were cautiously welcoming these strangers to their ancestral land. For a brief moment, on that September day, there was peace and shared humanity. So, if this incredible event happened in 1565 and was documented, why did it disappear from our history books for so long? The answer is complex, rooted in how history is written and remembered. For centuries, the dominant narrative of American origins centered on the English colonies in New England, the story of the Pilgrims at Plymouth, symbolizing perseverance, faith, and the beginnings of American democracy, fit neatly into the nation-building story the United States wanted to tell. The Spanish colonial experience, particularly in Florida, was often overlooked or downplayed. It was a different language, a different religion, Catholic instead of Protestant and it just didn't fit the preferred Anglo-centric storyline. The records of this 1565 feast were not lost, but rather, they were hidden in plain sight, tucked away in Spanish archives. The personal diary of Father Lopez, the chaplain who conducted the Mass, provides a first-hand account. He wrote, "The feast day was observed. After the Mass, the Adelantado Menendez had the Indians fed and dined himself. These documents were known to specialists, but had never broken through into the public consciousness. The Plymouth story was just too powerful. The rediscovery and popularization of this lost chapter of history is a modern story, and it's largely thanks to the tireless work of historians and many of them write in St. Augustine. One key figure was the historian Michael Gannon from the University of Florida. In the 1960s, he began to challenge the traditional narrative, publishing his research and famously declaring that the first Thanksgiving was in St. Augustine. His work was groundbreaking and, at the time, controversial. He faced pushback from those who felt he was trying to diminish the importance of the Plymouth story. But Gannon persisted, and his meticulous research, based on the original Spanish documents, was undeniable. He and other local historians in St. Augustine worked to bring this history to light. They started talking to the media, giving lectures, and working with museums. The community of St. Augustine embraced its unique heritage. Archaeologists at sites like the Fountain of Youth Archaeological Park, believed to be the original landing site of Menendez, unearthed artifacts that brought the 16th century settlement to life. They found evidence of the early colonists' diet and daily lives, painting a vivid picture that supported the documentary evidence. Through their combined efforts, academics, archaeologists, and local history enthusiasts, the story of the 1565 feast began to slowly re-emerge. It started with local news stories, then regional, and eventually gained national attention. Museums updated their exhibits. The city of St. Augustine began hosting annual reenactments of Menendez's landing and the subsequent feast, allowing people to see, hear, and even taste this forgotten piece of history. It is important to understand that acknowledging the 1565 feast doesn't mean we have to cancel the 1621 Plymouth story. Both events are significant parts of the American story. The Plymouth feast has its own unique context, representing a harvest celebration and the complex, evolving relationship between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag. But recognizing St. Augustine's earlier Thanksgiving enriches and complicates our understanding of our own origins. It reminds us that America's story didn't begin in one place. It had multiple starting points, with different people, different languages, and different traditions. The rediscovery of the 1565 feast forces us to look at a broader, more inclusive version of our past. It acknowledges the Spanish influence that is woven into the fabric of our nation, especially in the South and West. It reminds us that the first encounters between Europeans and Native Americans were not a single story, but a multitude of stories spread across time and geography. Today, when you visit St. Augustine, you can walk the same ground where those Spanish colonists and Timucua people shared their meal. You can feel the weight of over 450 years of continuous history. The work of those modern historians didn't just uncover a fun historical fact. They restored a foundational event to its rightful place in the American saga. They gave us a richer, more accurate, and more fascinating story of who we are and where we come from. So, this Thanksgiving, as you gather with your family, maybe you'll think of not just the Pilgrims, but also of Pedro Menéndez and the Saloy tribe. Maybe you'll swap out the mashed potatoes for some cosita. Okay, maybe not. But you will carry with you the knowledge that the American tradition of giving thanks is older, more diverse, and more interesting than most of us were ever taught. Thank you so much for joining me on this historical detective journey today. It's stories like these that show us history as a living, breathing thing, constantly being rediscovered and If you found this as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next exploration into the hidden corners of the past. Drop a comment below about the St. Augustine Thanksgiving. Until next time, stay curious. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into a story that rewrites a cornerstone of American history. For generations, we've all been taught about the Pilgrims and their 1621 feast at Plymouth Rock as the first Thanksgiving. But what if I told you the real story happened 56 years earlier and hundreds of miles to the south? Let's journey back to 1565 and uncover a feast that was almost lost to time. This isn't a myth or a legend. It's a documented historical event that we're only now beginning to fully appreciate, thanks to the tireless work of modern historians. The story begins not with English pilgrims, but with Spanish settlers led by an admiral named Pedro Menéndez de Avilés. On September 8, 1565, after a grueling transatlantic voyage, Menendez and his 800 colonists landed on the coast of what we now call Florida. They weren't just explorers. They were families, craftsmen, and soldiers coming to build a new life. And upon their safe arrival, the very first thing they did was hold a mass of Thanksgiving. Father Francisco Lopez de Mendoza Grajals, the fleet's chaplain, recorded the event in his diary. He wrote that after the mass, Menendez invited the local indigenous people, the Timucua tribe, to join them for a communal meal. This is the crucial detail. It wasn't just a European celebration. It was a shared event between newcomers and the native inhabitants. Can you imagine the scene? The Spanish, exhausted but grateful, sharing their limited provisions with the Timucua, who likely brought their own food to the gathering as well. So, what was on the menu? It certainly wasn't turkey and cranberry sauce. The Spanish would have served what they had left from their voyage, a hearty stew called cocido, made from salted pork, garbanzo beans, garlic, and hardtack biscuits, all washed down with red wine. The Timucua, in turn, probably contributed local fare like fish, alligator, corn, squash, and beans. It was a true melting pot of cultures, a feast of survival and tentative friendship, happening more than half a century before the Pilgrims even set sail on the Mayflower. For centuries, this incredible story was buried in dusty Spanish archives. The narrative of the Pilgrims at Plymouth became the dominant, anglicized version of America's origins. But in the 20th century, things started to change. Historians, particularly researchers, connected to St. Augustine, Florida, the very city Menendez, founded on that day in 1565, began to unearth these forgotten documents. They painstakingly translated the old Spanish records, like Father Lopez's diary, and pieced together the details of this earlier Thanksgiving. A huge credit goes to scholars like Dr. Michael Gannon from the University of Florida. Back in the 1960s, he stumbled upon the chaplain's account and brought it to public attention. His work was groundbreaking. He challenged the long-held beliefs and presented concrete evidence of the St. Augustine feast. Initially, there was resistance. It's hard to rewrite a story that's so deeply ingrained in a nation's identity. But the evidence was undeniable. The city of St. Augustine itself has been instrumental in reviving this history through archaeological digs, historical reenactments, and public education. They've worked to bring this lost chapter back into the light. Researchers at places like the St. Augustine Historical Society and Flagler College have dedicated their careers to separating fact from fiction, ensuring that the contributions of these Spanish settlers and their interaction with the Timucua people are accurately remembered. It is a powerful reminder that history is often more complex and diverse than the simplified versions we learn in school. The 1565 feast wasn't just a meal. It was the beginning of a continuous European settlement in the United States. It represents a different thread in the American story, one that is Hispanic, Catholic, and Southern, rather than English, Protestant, and Northern. Recognizing this event doesn't diminish the story of the Pilgrims. It enriches our understanding of the American experience, showing us that our roots are deeper and more varied than we ever imagined. This rediscovery process is ongoing. Every new document translated and every artifact unearthed in St. Augustine adds another layer to the story. It's a living history, being actively pieced together by dedicated researchers who are passionate about telling a more complete and inclusive story of our nation's beginnings. They are the heroes of this narrative, bringing the voices of Menendez, Father Lopez, and the Timucua people back to life after nearly 500 years of silence. So, the next time you gather for Thanksgiving, remember St. Augustine. Remember the Spanish settlers and the Timucua people who shared a meal of gratitude on a Florida beach in 1565. It is a testament to the fact that history is a vast, unfolding story, and there are always new chapters waiting to be rediscovered. Thank you so much for joining me on this historical journey today. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the hidden corners of history. We'd love to have you as part of our community. Until next time, stay curious. When you think of the first Thanksgiving, what comes to mind? Probably Pilgrims, maybe some Wampanoag people, a big feast with turkey. All happening in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Right. Well, what if I told you that story is only part of a much bigger, much older picture? What if the first Thanksgiving on American soil wasn't English at all, but Spanish, and it happened decades earlier? Let's travel back in time, not to 1621, but to September 8th, 1565. We're in what is now St. Augustine, Florida. A Spanish admiral named Pedro Menéndez de Avilés has just landed with over 800 settlers. They're exhausted after a long, difficult journey across the Atlantic. But they've made it. What's the first thing they do? They hold a mass of Thanksgiving. This isn't just a small prayer. It's a formal Catholic ceremony to thank God for their safe arrival. After the Mass, Menendez invites the local Seloe tribe, a part of the Timucua people, to join them for a meal. Now, this feast was very different from the one we imagine. Forget the pumpkin pie and cranberry sauce. The Spanish likely prepared a stew called cocido, made with salted pork, chickpeas, and garlic, all cooked in a single pot. The Timucua people, in turn, would have shared their local foods. Maybe some roasted alligator, gopher tortugas mullet, or even shellfish, along with corn, beans, and squash. Picture it. Two completely different cultures, speaking different languages, with different faiths, coming together. The Spanish, devout Catholics, sharing a meal with the Timucua, who had their own rich spiritual traditions. It was a moment of diplomacy, of curiosity, and of shared humanity. It wasn't about establishing a colony in the same way the English later would. It was a formal act of claiming the land for Spain and an immediate attempt at creating a relationship with the native inhabitants. This was a day of gratitude, a moment of peace, right there on the sunny coast of Florida. Now, let's jump forward 56 years to 1621 and head north to Plymouth, Massachusetts. This is the story most of us know. The Pilgrims, who were English separatists, had survived a brutal first winter when nearly half of their group perished. Their survival was largely thanks to the Wampanoag people, especially Tisquanum, or Squanto, who taught them how to plant corn, fish, and basically survive in this new environment. So, in the autumn of 1621, after a successful harvest, Governor William Bradford called for a celebratory feast. He invited the Wampanoag leader, Massasoit, who arrived with about 90 of his men. This celebration lasted for 3 whole days. It was a mix of English and Native American traditions. The Pilgrims contributed waterfowl, like duck and geese, that they had hunted. The Wampanoag brought 5 deer. They would have also feasted on the harvest. Corn, beans, squash, and likely a variety of seafood like lobster, clams, and mussels, which were abundant in the area. This Plymouth feast was a harvest festival, a secular celebration of survival and a successful crop. While the Pilgrims were deeply religious people who gave thanks to God daily, this specific event was more of a community party, a moment of relief and hope after a period of immense hardship. It was a partnership solidified over a shared meal, a recognition of their mutual dependence. The English needed the Wampanoags' knowledge to survive, and the Wampanoags saw a potential ally in these new arrivals. So we have 2 foundational Thanksgiving stories, one in St. Augustine in 1565, and one in Plymouth in 1621. Let's put them side by side. First, the people. In Florida, we have Spanish Catholic explorers and soldiers. In Massachusetts, we have English Protestant families seeking religious freedom. The native peoples were also different. The Timucua in the south and the Wampanoag in the north, each with their own unique cultures and languages. Next, the purpose. The Spanish Thanksgiving was a formal, religious ceremonia, Catholic, mass followed by a diplomatic meal. It was about claiming territory for a king and thanking God for a safe voyage. The Plymouth Thanksgiving was a secular harvest festival, a celebration of survival and a successful crop, more akin to a traditional English harvest home festival. And of course, the food. The Spanish brought their European staples: salted pork, chickpeas, hardtack biscuits, and red wine. They ate this alongside the local Floridian fare offered by the team. In Plymouth, the menu was all about the bounty of New England: deer waterfowl, corn, lobster, and native vegetables. The tastes and smells of these 2 feasts would have been worlds apart. Despite all these differences, different faiths, different foods, different languages, different motivations, there's a powerful thread connecting these 2 events. At the heart of both stories is a profound and universal human impulse, the need to give thanks. Think about it. Whether it was the Spanish admiral after a treacherous ocean crossing or the Pilgrim governor after a deadly winter, both leaders felt the need to pause and acknowledge their good fortune. They felt a need to gather their community and express gratitude for survival, for sustenance, and for the hope of a future. And in both instances, they chose to share that moment with the original inhabitants of the land. These meals were bridges. They were moments where suspicion and fear were set aside, at least for a little while, in favor of peace and shared humanity. Both feasts represent a moment of peaceful coexistence, a recognition that despite their differences, they were all people sharing the same space, dependent on the land and, to some extent, on each other. So, why does the Plymouth story get all the attention? A few reasons. History is often written by the victors, and English culture eventually became the dominant force in the founding of the United States. The Plymouth story, with its themes of religious freedom, perseverance, and the family-focused harvest festival, fit neatly into the national narrative that was being built. The Spanish story, being Catholic and tied to a rival empire, simply didn't fit that mold as well. But knowing both stories enriches our understanding of Thanksgiving. It shows us that the desire to give thanks is not exclusive to one group or one religion. It's a fundamental part of the human experience. It also reminds us that the history of America is far more complex and diverse than we often learn. The American story didn't just start with the English, Spanish, French, Dutch, and of course hundreds of native nations were all part of the fabric from the very beginning. So this year, when you gather for your own Thanksgiving, whatever it looks like, remember these two stories. Remember the Spanish Catholics in Florida and the English Protestants in Massachusetts. Remember the Timucua and the Wampanoag. Remember that across centuries and cultures, the spirit of gratitude is a powerful, unifying force. It's about recognizing the good in our lives and the connections we share with one another, and that is a tradition worth celebrating. Thanks so much for watching and exploring this fascinating piece of history with me. If you enjoyed this journey back in time, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. Let me know in the comments which Thanksgiving story you learned about as a kid. See you in the next video. Have you ever stopped to think about why we celebrate Thanksgiving? I mean, really think about it. Beyond the turkey and the pumpkin pie, it's a tradition that's woven into the very fabric of our culture, but its meaning has transformed so much over the centuries. Let's take a journey back in time to explore this beautiful lesson in gratitude. Imagine the very first Thanksgiving. It wasn't about perfectly set tables or finding the best Black Friday deals. It was about survival. It was a raw, visceral expression of thanks for making it through a brutal year. The Pilgrims and the Wampanoag people coming together after a harvest that meant the difference between life and death. The gratitude they felt was tied to the very earth beneath their feet, to the sky above, to the simply profound fact that they were still here. It was a gratitude rooted in faith and the sheer relief of survival. The air would have been crisp, the food simple but life-sustaining. The thankfulness wasn't a polite sentiment. It was a deep collective sigh of relief. Fast forward through the years. As our nation grew and changed, so did Thanksgiving. It became a national holiday, a day to pause and reflect on the blessings of a young, burgeoning country. It was a time to celebrate peace after turmoil, to find unity in shared values. The focus shifted from just surviving to thriving. Gratitude became intertwined with patriotism, with the promise of a better future. Families would gather, perhaps with a bit more on their tables, and give thanks for the opportunities their new world afforded them. The core feeling was still there, but it was now dressed in the clothes of progress and national identity. Now, think about the Thanksgiving, For many of us, it's a holiday defined by family, comfort, and abundance. It's the smell of roasting turkey filling the house, the sound of laughter echoing through rooms, the warmth of being surrounded by loved ones. The focus is shifted again, from bare-bones survival to the rich tapestry of our personal lives. We give thanks for our homes, for our health, for the people who make our lives meaningful. The table is often groaning with food, a symbol not just of a good harvest, but of prosperity and the comfort of modern life. Isn't it fascinating? From survival and faith, to patriotism and progress, to the intimate circle of family and friends. The asterisk reasons, asterisk for our gratitude, have evolved, mirroring our own journey as a society. What was once a desperate prayer for survival has become a warm celebration of the life we've built. We've moved from thanking God for a meager harvest that kept starvation at bay, to thanking our lucky stars for a promotion at work, for a child's good report card, for the simple joy of a quiet afternoon. But here's the most beautiful part. Despite all these changes, the core emotion, that central feeling, remains exactly the same. It's that profound sense of thankfulness. It's the act of consciously pausing to recognize the good in our lives. Whether you re a pilgrim marveling at a basket of corn or you re-texting a friend to say how much you appreciate them, the feeling is universal. It's the same human heart beating with gratitude. This feeling of thankfulness, I assent to just a once-a-year thing we dust off in November. It's a lesson. The lesson of Thanksgiving is that no matter our circumstances, there is always something to be grateful for. It teaches us to look beyond what we lack and to cherish what we have. It's a reminder that our greatest wealth isn't in our possessions, but in our connections with each other, with our history, and with the world around us. The Pilgrims were thankful for a harvest that would see them through the winter. We might be thankful for a warm house on a cold day. They were thankful for the unexpected friendship of the Wampanoag. We might be thankful for the support of a colleague or the kindness of a stranger. The scale may be different, but the sentiment is identical. It's about recognizing the gifts, big and small, that fill our days. And that's the true spirit of this holiday. It's not just about the past. It's about the present. It is about looking at the person sitting across the table from you and feeling a surge of love and appreciation. It's about savoring a delicious meal and being thankful for the nourishment it provides. It's about acknowledging the comfort of your home, the stability of your life, the simple, everyday miracles we so often overlook. The story of Thanksgiving is a story of resilience, of community, and ultimately, of a gratitude that adapts and endures. It shows us that no matter how much the world changes, the human need to give thanks is a constant. It is a thread that connects us to those who came before us and will connect us to the generations that follow. So this year, as you gather with your loved ones, take a moment to reflect on this journey. Think about the layers of meaning behind your celebration. Yes, be thankful for the food, the comfort, the family, but also be thankful for the lesson itself. The lesson that gratitude is timeless. It's a powerful, beautiful force that has sustained people through the hardest of times and elevated them in the best of times. It's the true feast, the one that nourishes the soul. The feeling is, and always will be, thankfulness for what we have and for who we have to share it with. Thank you so much for joining me on this reflection today. I hope it added a little something special to your understanding of this holiday. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel for more content like this. It really helps us grow. Until next time, take care and be well. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our journey through the hidden corners of history. Today, we're rediving into a story that might just change the way you think about one of America's most cherished traditions. We all know the classic tale of Thanksgiving, right? The Pilgrims, Plymouth Rock, a grand feast with Native American friends in 1621. It is a story woven into the fabric of our culture. But what if I told you that the first documented Thanksgiving feast by Europeans in what is now the United States did happen in mass? What if it took place more than half a century earlier, under the warm sun of Florida? Let's travel back in time, not to the chilly coast of New England, but to the sandy shores of Florida. The year is 1565. The world is a very different place. Spain is the dominant global power, and its ambitions in the New World are vast. On September 8th of that year, a Spanish admiral named Pedro Menéndez de Avilés waits ashore. He's not a pilgrim seeking religious freedom. He's a conquistador, a military man on a mission from the King of Spain to establish a permanent colony and drive out French competitors who had settled nearby. After a perilous journey across the Atlantic, Menendez and his 800 colonists, sailors, and their families finally made landfall. They named the spot St. Augustine. Imagine the scene. Exhausted but relieved, they set foot on this new, strange land. It was a moment of immense significance, and how did they choose to mark this momentous occasion? With a mass of thanksgiving. Father Francisco L. Lopez de Mendoza Grasals, the chaplain of the expedition, led the service. He recorded the event in his diary, giving us a precious first-hand account. After the religious ceremony, Menendez did something remarkable. He invited the local indigenous people, the Timucua tribe, to join them for a meal. The Timucua had been watching the newcomers, curious and likely cautious, yet They accepted the invitation. Now, picture this feast. It wasn't turkey, stuffing, and cranberry sauce. The Spaniards had limited provisions left from their voyage. They likely shared what they had. A hearty stew called cocido, made with salted pork, garbanzo beans, and garlic, all cooked with ship's bread. The Timucua, in turn, brought their own contributions from the land's bounty. We're talking fresh fish, wild turkey, venison, corn, beans, and squash. It was a true coming together of two vastly different worlds, sharing a meal in a spirit of peace and gratitude, however temporary that peace might have been. This event in St. Augustine in 1565 holds all the key elements we associate with Thanksgiving: a safe arrival, a religious service of thanks, and a communal meal shared between Europeans and Native Americans. It predates the Pilgrims' feast by a full 56 years. So why has this story been largely overshadowed? Well, history is often written by the victors, or in this case, by the dominant culture. As the English colonies grew in power and influence, their narratives, their founding myths, naturally took center stage. The story of the Pilgrims at Plymouth, with its themes of perseverance and religious liberty, resonated deeply with the identity of the burgeoning United States. The Spanish Catholic heritage of Florida didn't fit as neatly into that Protestant-led narrative. The Plymouth story was promoted heavily in the 19th century, especially by writers and historians from New England. Sara Josepa Ali, the same woman who wrote Mary Had a Little Lamb, campaigned for decades to make Thanksgiving a national holiday, and she championed the Pilgrim story as its origin. When Abraham Lincoln officially declared Thanksgiving a national holiday in 1863, during the Civil War, the Plymouth narrative was cemented in the national consciousness. It was a story of unity and American exceptionalism that was needed at a time of deep division. But rediscovering the Florida story doesn't diminish the Plymouth Thanksgiving. Instead, it enriches our understanding. It shows us that the act of giving thanks upon reaching the New World was not a singular event. It was a human impulse, repeated in different places by different people. It complicates the simple story we've been told and adds layers of depth. It reminds us that America's history is a mosaic, made up of many different tiles, many different stories, from many different cultures: Spanish, English, French, and most importantly, the countless Native American nations who were here long before anyone else. The relationship between the Spanish and the Timucua, like most interactions between colonizers and indigenous peoples, would become fraught with conflict and tragedy. We can't and shouldn't ignore that difficult history. But for one day, on that September afternoon in 1565, there was a shared meal. There was a moment of communion. It is fascinating to think about how these historical narratives are shaped and why some are remembered while others fade. It's a reminder to always dig a little deeper, to question the stories we think we know, and to search for the voices that have been quieted over time. The St. Augustine Feast is a powerful piece of our shared American heritage, a testament to a moment of peace and gratitude on a Florida beach. Long before Pilgrims, on a sandy Florida shore, strangers bowed their heads in thanks. Their story was forgotten but not lost. And maybe, as we give thanks today, we remember them too. Thank you so much for joining me on this historical detour. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button. And consider subscribing for more deep dives into the chapters of history they do not always teach you in school. We'll see you in the next one.